Okay, the 15th Amendment was the final of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it said that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, what this fancy thing means is that all citizens of the United States are allowed to vote no matter what race they are, what color they are, or if they used to be a servant or a slave. So, this amendment, the 15th, some would argue that this one is the most important of the Reconstruction Amendments, said that all men of any race or color have the right to vote. So this one passed, and all free men in the United States, regardless of color, all free citizens of the United States, which, by the way, women were not citizens of the United States just yet, were allowed to vote. Now, unfortunately, even though they were allowed to vote, many free men or free African Americans in the South faced a lot of problems when they tried to vote. Um, the KKK, the White League, other groups in the southern states formed basically in order to intimidate and scare off free men who would try to exercise their right to vote. So, they would try to prevent them from doing so. They would threaten their families. They would threaten to kill them. Sometimes they did kill them. They would beat them up. All these different things that could happen to them if they wanted to exercise that right to vote. The other thing that happened is that this was what was the 15th Amendment was supposed to look like. Okay, so here's a voting booth, and the left part over here, they're voting here. There's a man running the voting booth, and then there's all these free African American men who are in line to vote. This was what the 15th Amendment was supposed to do. But the reality of the 15th Amendment, especially in the South, looked a lot more like this. So here's this man. Okay, so there's a free man. He came to vote. So these guys are doing one of two things. They're either saying, okay, you're going to vote how I tell you to, so that the guy I want to vote is actually going to win, or you're going to get out of here and you're not going to vote at all. I know you have the right, but I don't want you to. So a lot of what happened in the South, a lot of the reality of the South was that even though all citizens, all African American men were allowed to vote, they didn't actually have that freedom and they didn't have that privilege in a lot of the states at the time. So the southern states, a lot like those black codes we talked about earlier, the southern states came up with all these other ways to keep people, the free men or African Americans, from voting. On this side, this is a picture of a voting booth, and there's a sign on this window that very clearly says that only white people can vote here. So they would have said this was a white voting booth. You have to go find a black voting booth. They also came up with things like a literacy test and a grandfather clause. And a literacy test meant that you had to literally pass a reading and writing test before you could vote. Now, this made a lot of free African American men not be able to vote because, remember, during slavery, slaves were not legally allowed to learn to read or write. So many of these free men had grown up in slavery, never learned to read and write. So then they would not be able to vote. And then there was also something called a grandfather clause, which some southern states said, hey, if your grandfather could vote before 1867, then you get to vote. Except the majority of the free men, their grandfathers, their fathers, their ancestors had been slaves as well. So of course we're not able to vote during that. So that would immediately eliminate a large population of those African American men in these southern states where these laws were happening to keep them from voting. Okay, so all of these things happened, not fair, but they did happen as a result of the 15th Amendment.